The most important part to any zoo is the animals in the enclosures they call home. Throughout the series, I'll be designing different enclosures for an array of animals, whilst also keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Join me each week as I tackle a new enclosure and idea and try and bring it to life within Planet Zoo. Today I am building a meerkat enclosure, and this will sit opposite the aardvarks within the Africa area of the zoo. Before we start, let's have a little look at the stats for the meerkats. They don't need a huge land requirement and the fencing can be quite small. I'm planning to go with a all-female group here because obviously they do live in quite large groups, as you can see on the screen now. Starting the build, there was these Indonesian fence panels that had been added since I last worked on this area of the zoo, and I was determined to get that included in this part of the build. I wanted to keep the African mud themed walls all the way around the edge, but so I could get these square pieces, which you can see on screen now, into the build because I really like them. I used them along the back paneling here on the enclosure. The rest of the walls are going in now, and as you can see, I placed loads of gaps around. This is where I wanted floor to the height of the fence full of glass. I didn't quite want it to follow the same theme as the aardvarks, but very similar with them being opposite each other. You can see on screen now I'm fiddling about with trying to add some curved walls. I wasn't really sure how best to do it, but I tried to fill in the space as best as possible. I've learned quite a few tricks from these builds, and the best thing to do is to start with the glass paneling, go round and measure them up properly like you can see I'm doing now, and then fill in the rest of the barriers on the way round. So far this has been a pretty straightforward build because I have had this idea in mind for a while. The build was being a little bit fiddly here. It wasn't letting me place those fences along with the path, which was frustrating because that wall did run along quite nicely, but I look at filling in that path later on in the build. All the glass paneling in, I start to make work on the knoll barriers. This has become a lot easier as well. I do like to stick with following the wall line. It isn't necessary because I could just make the barriers wider than the enclosure itself. It mean it'd save a bit more time, but because this is quite a small enclosure, I didn't bother with that. Here I'm getting in the keeper gate. I thought this was a nice little spot round the back here near the toilets. It was a good place to have all of this stuff going on, and later on you will see I add a viewing dome very similar to the one I used in the capybara enclosure. We're already at the part of the build where we get the animal into the enclosure. So this is where I start filling in the space, and I have a lot of these underground domes for the meerkats to sleep in. I didn't want the food tray to be too big either, and it did say there was a requirement for a lot of enrichment, so you will find there is a lot of that in this enclosure. One thing that is very common in all meerkat enclosures is these high mounds. So as you can see, I've gone round the enclosure and filled that in. Here I'm just trying to get the textures right and make sure it all looks good. Obviously I wanted a lot more sand than what there actually is because meerkats normally are seen in the sand, but it likes this very varied texture on the ground. Here are those enrichment pieces going in. I used an array of different pieces, took some out in the end because they were taking up quite a bit of space. But obviously these meerkats, need to be enriched, and obviously with them being such a large group as well, there needs to be plenty to go around. Something I found a little frustrating with this build, and I suppose quite common really, was the lack of foliage. Meerkats don't really need a huge amount, so I was trying to make do with just these little clumps of grasses and like patches of bushes. Obviously rock work was something I wanted to feature as well, but I didn't want to go over the top with it, and I mainly stuck with that around the mound. I do later add a really big tree in that sort of semicircle bit, as it's not quite in the enclosure itself. Here I am just circling around over the build to see if there's anything else I can do, and I was also waiting on more meerkats to be delivered. I believe there was about 5 females in this group in the end, which will obviously expand as I build on the zoo. The final part of this build was getting in the viewing dome, and as you can see, I'm moving this all around the enclosure trying to make it fit. I looked at moving other pieces around and it didn't quite work. In the end, I managed to find a nice little sweet spot, and it wasn't too far away from the wall itself, so it sit quite nicely in the enclosure when I found the viewing dome entrance. That was the inside of the enclosure finished. Next thing to do was to theme it up and make it very similar to the aardvark enclosure opposite. I started by placing these screens and working out where I wanted them. Annoyingly, when I copied them over, they had the aardvark on the image, so I had to go around and change all of them, but that wasn't an issue in the end. I was trying to use different theming pieces. I didn't want to carry too much over and repeat the same thing, which I like to think I didn't do too much of. And I also added some really cool theming pieces inside the meerkat enclosure, which just added a little bit of height to the build. One of the last things to do is just to fill in these blank walls with these nice little paneling pieces, just to add a pop of colour, because that mud wall can be quite bland. Here's just the odd little theming piece going around the edge, and the final thing to top it all off was the big palm tree in the semicircle here. Overall, I'm really happy with this build, and I love building these smaller enclosures because they're so much fun and quick and easy to do.